So welcome everybody. Takes a little bit of time to get you all in on Zoom. I've seen more than 100 of you waiting in the waiting room. So come in, pull up a chair, help yourself to a drink. You're in for a treat over the next hour or so. Thank you very much for joining us for this latest installment of Pop Conversations, our sixth in this series. Before I introduce our fantastic guest this evening, just let me make a few housekeeping points. Just to remind you, we are recording this conversation. It will be reproduced. It will go up on our YouTube channel later. You can submit questions. I've got a whole bunch of questions I'm going to ask our guest today, but I want to hear from you too. But to submit a question, don't put it in the chat box. Make sure you open the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. Click on Q&A. You can type in your question there. And not only can you put a question, but you can judge which other questions you want me to put. And as I'm a very, very democratic kind of guy, I'll tend to put the questions which have got the most votes to them. So that's in the question and answer box. And throughout the next hour or so, I might lob in a few polls as well. We'd like to take the temperature of the room on a couple of issues. You can vote on those. You don't have to, but just to reassure you, they're anonymized. We can't track back to who's voted which way. It's just to get a feeling of the temperature of the room. And last thing to say is you might see that some of you have already used it. I can see there's a react button at the bottom of the screen. So you can't actually shout or cheer or clap, but you can do the next best thing. You can click on the react button and indicate that you're enjoying the event, you agree with something that's been said, or such like. So get those emojis flowing. So those are all that's all of the basics of the housekeeping. You can see we've already got a couple of questions coming in. Now it's time for me to introduce our fantastic guest, good friend of mine, good ally of mine over many years, the brilliant Dr. Arthur Laffer. Everyone will have heard of the Laffer curve. We're going to be talking a bit about that and what it means. And here's the man after whom that curve was named. Dr. Arthur Laffer. Art is probably the most influential economist in the world in recent decades. His economic acumen and influence in triggering a worldwide tax-cutting movement in the 1980s has earned him the distinction in many publications of being described as the father of supply-side economics. He was a founding member of the Reagan Executive Advisory Committee for the presidential race of 1980, and then a member of President Reagan's Economic Policy Advisory Board for both of his two terms in office, 80 to 89. He also advised our own Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher, on fiscal policy and economic policy in the 1980s. He has authored over 20 books, including the New York Times bestseller, An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of States, and Tax Have Consequences, another absolute corker of the book. In 2019, his achievements were recognized when he was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom. Those are his brilliant antecedents. Also worth saying, he is a sprightly 83 years old, has 6 children, 13 grandchildren, and 4 great-grandchildren at the last count, and is also a fantastic wit, raconteur, and storyteller. You're in for a treat. Art, my friend, wonderful to have you with us. Hello.
Thank you, Mark. I've got 14 grandchildren now. Talking about getting up to date, there's a new one
wow.
that's just been delivered. So there we go.
There you go. Shows you can't trust Wikipedia, right?
I figure if we can't convince the liberals, we might as well just outpopulate them.
Good way of doing it. One person at a time, one new birth at a time. So, it's lovely to see you again. Lovely to have you with us.
Mark. Thank you.
I want to talk a little bit about the kind of concept of the Laffer curve, where it came from, what we learned from it back in the day. And I think most people will be familiar with it, but tell me if I've got anything wrong here. You basically popularized something that was in economic thinking for some time. And you famously did this, so it's said, you'll have to tell us whether the story's apocryphal, on the back of a napkin in a meeting, I think, with Donald Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney in the 70s. And the idea was this. If tax revenue is what you're worried about, if you tax, say, income at 0%, you're clearly not going to raise any revenue. Similarly, if you tax income at 100%, you won't raise any revenue because nobody will work. And therefore, from naught, you could start increasing taxes and revenues would come in. But at some point, you hit the peak of a curve, and actually beyond that peak, actually higher tax rates equals lower tax revenue. That was basically the insight, right?
Got it. You got it perfectly.
And tell us.
Go ahead.
Well, what I was keen to know is, tell us about that story with the napkin with Cheney and Rumsfeld.
The story
and what it led to. What it led to.
Well, the curve, as you say, has been around forever and ever and ever. Ibn Khaldun, 1,000 years ago in the Muqaddimah, has it very clearly stated. It's been in Adam Smith has it very, David Ricardo, John Maynard Keynes has one of the best examples of it I've ever seen. It's been around forever, but for some reason it was laid to rest during the 60s and early 70s. And everyone just assumed that if you raise tax rates by 10%, revenues would increase by 10%. And that was just the common thought. And then all the rest followed. And there was one bill that was called Whip Inflation Now by Jerry Ford. That was a 5% tax surcharge. And this 5% tax surcharge, they assumed, would raise tax revenues by 5%. And I was trying to argue or discuss with Dick Cheney, who was my classmate at Yale and deputy chief of staff to the president, and Don Rumsfeld, one of my dearest friends, who was chief of staff to the president, that, if you raise tax rates by 5%, you might get 4% more revenue. You might get 2%. You might even lose revenues, but you will not get 5% more revenues. That clearly is wrong. And going through that, well, they were surprised. And I drew this little curve on a napkin illustrating just what you said. And it's a pedagogic device, by the way, to illustrate. And it's not just how much you work and all that, but it's also the tax sheltering. It's also tax evasion, tax avoidance, all this other stuff that comes along with it. But it's just illustrates this effect. And they seem to like it. And so from then on, every dinner I went to for years, I just kept drawing napkins and napkins and napkins. No, just joking. It's like a good joke. Once you tell a good joke and people laugh, you keep telling that joke until you've overexposed it. But that's where I am.
Right. And let's go back to the 1970s and the 1980s, because I think a good number of us in Britain would think that history is repeating itself a bit at the moment, and we're almost back in the 1970s in some strange way. Tell us a bit about the impact of this on the policies of particularly President Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, how it changed the debate. We get the concept, but we then actually had dramatic reductions, especially in high marginal rates of taxation, right?
Yeah. Well, with some of you, the book you mentioned, Taxes Have Consequences, that I wrote with Dr. Brian Dimitrovic and Dr. Gene Sinkfield, it's with my work for the last 40 years, looks at the entire history of the U.S. income tax from 1913 to the present. And we've gone through all sorts of higher rates, lower rates, and a lot of variation in there in 110 or 111 years worth. And it's equally as true with Reagan and with Thatcher as well, that every single time we've raised the highest marginal income tax rate, every single time, what has happened statistically, what's happened from the numbers, we have every single tax return, by the way, Mark. What's happened is every time you raise the highest marginal income tax rate, the economy underperforms. Tax revenues from the rich go down, and the poor get hammered. Every single time we've lowered tax rates on the rich, the economy has outperformed. Tax revenues from the top 1% of income earners has gone up, and the poor, the minorities, the disenfranchised have performed exceptionally well by historical standards. That's very true when Gordon Brown, if you'll remember, when you're prime minister, raised the highest marginal income tax from 40p to 50p. If you look at the exchequer that year, 2 years later, they had the Laffer section in there. I don't know if you'll remember that, but if you go through all those things, exactly the same thing happens in Britain. It's very clear there. I mean, Lady Thatcher dropped the highest rate from, I think, almost 98%, if you go to the extreme, down to 40%. And just look at what happened in Britain and the prosperity. And it's true in Germany. It's just universal. Rich people don't mind paying their fair share. They really don't. They don't mind paying their fair share, but they don't want to be ripped off and they don't want to be exploited. And if you raise tax rates on the rich people beyond what they think is warranted, they're going to hire lawyers, accountants, deferred income specialists, favor grabbers, lobbyists. They're going to hang out with the presidents and all that sort of stuff, all to seek favors, to change the location of their income, the timing of their income, the composition of their income, and even the volume of their income that is going to lower their taxes dramatically. And that's what they do, and that's what the numbers show. I can easily imagine the opposite being true. I mean, you raise tax rates, you collect more money from the rich, you give it to the poor, you make everyone better off except for the rich, but they can afford it. You know, Robin Hood, and that's possible. And it's also possible what I told you. This is about facts, not about how you feel. It's not about opinions. The facts are very clear that when you do cut the tax rates on the rich, you get a much better performance. That's the way the world really operates.
So I've got, I guess, a couple of questions emanating from that. I mean, first, it's worth saying that it needn't necessarily be the ambition of the government to hit the peak of the Laffer curve, right? But
No,
the
it
key
should
thing
not
is
be.
not to be on the wrong side of it. There might be a
That's
good
for sure.
reason to be on the
There's
right
no
side
upside
of it.
here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But if you were looking for that peak in the Laffer curve, and you were looking at, you've just mentioned income tax, Art, how do you determine what that rate is? You know, should the top marginal rate of income tax, I don't know, be 30%, 35, 38, 42, 27? Is this just trial and error, and do you just need to chew through the numbers to keep watching it? And over what period of time? Because obviously sometimes, you know, there could be different factors in play in any given year. So how do you actually move it from the abstract drawing on all of the napkins that you've drawn all over into actually putting numbers on that graph?
Well, Saez, economist there in Berkeley, who did this stuff with Piketty and Sancheva and Zuckman and all these guys, the redistributionist type of people, argues that it's 73%. And he has this big, long mathematical formula, which is just as ridiculous as anything you've ever seen in your life. He says it's 73%. Yet we had 3 years in the US where the highest rate was exactly 73%. 1919, 1920, and 1921. And then we dropped it down to 25%. And guess what happened to revenues? They went way up. The economy ran surpluses for everything. I mean, these people are just silly. What you want to know is what you want to look at is, number one, you're always correct, Mark, when you say you never want to be on the prohibitive range of the Laffer curve. There is no upside. If you lower tax rates and you collect more revenue, everyone's better off by doing so. And there's no logical system except one of hate that would ever take you to that range. Now, once you get to the maximizing rate, whatever that means, then where do you want to play? And the truth of the matter is, you don't want to be at the maximizing rate, because that really says there's no benefit to lower taxes versus higher taxes. There is, clearly. You clearly want to be way down in the lower range for the economy. You want people to be employed, jobs, output, income, in addition to maximizing revenue for the government. So you look there. What you know is the larger the tax base, the more likely it is that you will be in the normal range of the Laffer curve. Little bitty bases with high tax rates almost always make no sense whatsoever. You want the broadest possible tax base with the lowest possible tax rate to provide the best revenue system for the Laffer curve. The longer you're willing to wait, the more people can adjust to and do all of that stuff and take advantage of it, the better, the more it'll be a lower rate, better output production. I mean, you know, it takes a long time to build up a capital stock of a country, and it takes a long time to destroy it. Just look at France. They've been destroying their capital stock for a century now, and they've still got a lot of wonderful stuff. If you look at this, what you want to do is make sure that you build this for the long term. So you want the lowest rate possible on the broadest base. And that's where I think you really get the maximal point, not the highest point, but the best point from the standpoint of the benefits to society of a tax rate. The lowest possible tax rate on the broadest possible tax base with the least amount of evasion, avoidance, tax shelters, credits, deductions, exemptions, exclusions, all of that stuff. You have a low rate, broad-based flat tax is really where you want to be. And as you say, you never want to be in the prohibitive range. That makes no sense ever.
And answer me this, Art. Is it possible to look at the Laffer curve of all taxes in aggregate? So you could have, I mean, the curve will be a different shape for, say, the highest rate of income tax, and for sales tax, and for petrol tax and alcohol tax, and I think the line, I may have even cribbed it from you, that if tax on tobacco is designed to discourage smoking and tax on alcohol is designed to encourage drinking, then what's income tax designed to do? But could we merge them all together and imagine a kind of Laffer curve for the total amount of tax taken out of the economy? Because one of the things that's fascinated me in the UK is over my lifetime and going back 10 or 15 years before I was born, we've basically tried every mix of tax policies you could possibly imagine. Top rates of 98%, top rates of 40%, VAT at 5%, exactly. VAT at 20%. But one thing seems clear, that the government just can't squeeze out more than about 38% of GDP in tax, whatever it tries. Sometimes it doesn't aim that high, but even if you've got a ravenous government, that seems to be about the maximum it can squeeze out of the economy.
I think so. And that you're just looking at the rates now, not total taxes. If you look at total taxes, you can have 38% on a small base and you get very little revenues, or 38% on a very large base. So even looking at 38, you don't want to do it that way. You really want to look at total taxes, not taxes as a share of GDP, is what you want to do there. But I mean, there are two functions, Mark, that you really think of in taxes, and you hit them both dead on. One is taxes that are punitive to get people to stop doing things. Mm-hmm. You know, all taxes are bad. Some are worse than others. And what you want to do is tax bad things, so get people to stop doing alcohol, tobacco, firearms, is the ones I joke about. We Americans don't like drunk people smoking while we shoot each other. Just joking. But then there's the revenue aspect of it. On the tax revenue side of it, you know, all taxes are bad. Some are worse than others. And so what you want to do is collect the requisite revenues your country needs to run public services in the least damaging fashion possible. And that really comes out to a low rate, broad-based flat tax. And, you know, while you may be able to pretend that you know all the net elasticities and supply functions of every different person in there, your famous economist, Mirrlees, had it down to a supply curve for every person. Then, you know, if there's a Mirrlees section in the Exchequer as well as the Laffer section, as you know, and the Mirrlees taxes there. And if you look at that, you would be able to, if you were God and knew the elasticity, you could really design it, but you'd have to move it every second, every hour, every minute, every day. You know, bottom line is, given that you don't know what the net elasticities are, you want to lump all taxes together. You do. And you want it on the broadest possible tax base and the lowest possible tax rate, and just go with it, and stop all this stuff of trying to figure out which tax where, import duty and that subsidy. I mean, that really is a fool's errand, and you're going to end up really in bad shape. The other one, and I'll let you ask this in your own way, is to redistribute income. And redistributing income is a very interesting one, because your friend Piketty and Saez and those guys, those creepy people, who will never, by the way, debate. I've proposed debates with them. I've done about 5 debates on income redistribution, and they just will not do it. They're afraid, for good reason. The facts are against them. But if you do it there, you've got a really interesting things going on. It's called the transfer theorem. And can I have a second with you on a transfer?
Please.
Because I know you know this, and I know your friends know this as well, but it's worth going through because it's math. You know, it's not left wing, it's not right wing, it's not liberal or conservative, left or Republican or Democrat. It's just plain math. For tall people at Harvard, short people at Yale, fat ones, skinny ones, old ones, young ones, male ones, female ones, all sorts of different groups. It's just purely math. And the transfer theorem has to do with redistribution, which is what our countries, and what basically all countries, have been trying to do. And a transfer is when you take from any one group and give it to another group. That's a transfer from old to young, or young to old, or fat to skinny, whatever it may be. All right. The one we like to think about, that I'm going to use in the example here, is from those who have a little bit more and transfer those goods to those who have a little bit less. Here is the transfer theorem. You raise taxes on the rich, and you give the proceeds to the poor to make the poor a little bit better off, and God knows they need it, and to make the rich a little bit less well off, but God knows they can afford the loss in income. But let me go through the theorem with you. And I'm just going to talk about the math of taking from those who make a little bit more and giving to those who make a little bit less. You with me on this?
Yeah.
Now, if you take from those who make a little bit more, you reduce their incentives to work, and they will work a little bit less. You with me on that?
Yeah.
By giving to those who have a little bit less, make a little bit less, you provide them with an alternative source of income other than working, and they too will work a little bit less. This is just your Slutsky equations, the substitution effects, and the income effects. That's all it is. When you take from those who make a little bit more, you reduce their incentives to work, and they'll produce a little bit less. By giving to those who have a little bit less, you reduce their incentives to produce, and they too will produce a little bit less. The theorem here is really explicit. It's simple math. Whenever you redistribute income, period, you reduce total income. That's math. Now, the neat thing about this theorem is that it's not only math, that whenever you redistribute income, you reduce total income, but the lemma of this theorem is also beautiful and delicious and nice and flavorful. And I'm not going to prove this one verbally, but let me just say it if I can. The more you redistribute, the greater will be the reduction in total income. You with me in that? I'm not going to prove it, but it should be just patently obvious to your audience that that's true. The one I do want to prove again is the limit function of this theorem. The limit function is really nice. It's got this spicy piquant flavor with garlic. Oh my God, it makes my eyes water and my mouth water there. And let me just say this theorem again, and it's a theorem here. If you were able to redistribute income completely and totally so that everyone came out exactly the same, all right, if you were able to do that, there will be no income whatsoever. Now, let me prove it to you, Mark, because it's so neat proving. In order to get everyone to come out exactly the same, what you would have to do is tax everyone above the average income 100% of the excess, and subsidize everyone below the average income up to the average income. Only in this way can we guarantee that everyone will come out exactly the same. Now, if you actually did tax everyone above the average income 100% of the excess, and if you actually did subsidize everyone below the average income up to the average income, I'll stipulate today, counselor, we'll all come out equal at zero. And you know, it's just simple. If you tax people who work and you pay people who don't work, don't be surprised if you find a lot of people not working. Now, I tried to explain this to my students in my class because it's really hard to explain it to them because they've never worked in their lives. They're students after all. I mean, so they don't really get this sort of FICA stuff and these taxes and all that. You know, that's sort of their parents or grandparents or something. So what I tried to do is make an example so that they could see this theorem come to light. And I said, you know, if I ran this class the way your government runs your country, what I would do is I'd flunk all the A students out and I'd give all the F students scholarships. Now, before you smile, Mark, stop. Before you smile, remember that my A students happen to be a little smarter than my F students. So my A students are able to get lower grades than my F students because they never randomly make the mistake of guessing a correct answer. My A students still get all the scholarships, Mark. My F students are still flunked out. I have not changed the distribution of grades one iota, but what have I done? I've destroyed the entire quality of the educational process. To put it succinctly, every revolution on planet Earth has been fought to change the distribution of income. And not one of them has ever succeeded. But what they have all succeeded in doing is destroying the volume of income. And you right now are in the midst of the throes of an enormous experiment that's going to reprove that theorem once again, just as that horrible guy Gordon Brown proved before. I mean, when he raised it from 40p to 50p, and then Cameron, what did you call those people, wets?
Yeah.
Cameron, oh my God, ooh, we'll lower it from 50 to 45p. What? If you know it works badly, the wondering, lower it below where it had been before. But no, not that. So, I mean, we have those people too here. I wish Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren and AOC were listening to our debate today and discussion on this podcast. But it's just crazy. And these people just they don't know straight up from sick'em.
So this is so interesting. What you've said about the destructive nature of redistribution, or perfect form of redistribution. It does seem that in public policy discourse, we are completely fixated on slicing up a smaller pie rather than growing the pie. I mean, I actually hate the term growing the pie. You don't grow pies, you bake pies. But a bigger pie would be nice. But everybody seems to think the pie is fixed, and the only issue is how to slice it up. And somehow we've got to cut through in public discourse to sort of disprove that line of
well, I hope I just helped a little bit on that theorem.
Yeah, very much so.
Theorem is really clear. I mean, and it's true all the time. And but the earth they are scorching is their earth too, by the way. I just thought I'd tell you that the poor people in America did not do well under socialist governments. Believe me when I tell you, the Great Depression was not good for poor people. The 1970s there with Johnson, Nixon, Ford, and Carter was really awful for the poor, the minority, the disenfranchised. Kennedy was great for the lowest incomes. Reagan was great for it. Trump was great for the lowest incomes. And Harding and Coolidge were great for the lowest incomes. Roosevelt was terrible. Hoover was terrible. It's not Republican or Democrat either. It's just bad economics.
So let me we've gone a bit through the theory, a little bit through the history of the 80s. Let's bring it up to speed today. I think just before we came on air, you were pointing out that bizarrely enough, we decided to hold our general election in Britain on US Independence Day, and your presidential election is on Guy Fawkes Day, where we in Britain celebrate the execution of a betrayer who tried to blow up the Houses of Parliament. So we kind of got the days the wrong way round.
Are you sure that was a betrayer? Just saying there. If you got government out of the way just for a little bit, maybe you'd be in better shape.
It is sometimes joked that Guy Fawkes is the only man to have entered Parliament with good and noble intentions.
Thank you. There you go. There you go. I love it. I love it. I love it.
But let's look at where we are today. So we have the Labour Party back in power. It's all about redistribution. Very little. I mean, they sort of mime the words economic growth, but it all seems to be big industrial plans to get there and government skills. But we had an experiment here with my good friend Liz Truss, and I'm going to go to one of the questions here. It's the most upvoted question from Simon Moorhead. She attempted in her mini budget, now much maligned, to begin to get these taxes back down. She'd committed to reversing a rise in national insurance contributions, effectively an income tax, and to reverse a rise in corporation tax. But she tried to go that bit further, get that top rate of tax down to 40%, which even if you did no dynamic modeling was a pretty small tax cut, right? But the whole thing sort of blew up in her face. What do you think went wrong here? Was it a lack of political will? Was something else going on the side of the economy? Because Simon Moorhead says, can you ask Dr. Laffer to comment on Liz Truss's period in charge? As I and many others loved the budget and thought she had all the right notes. Did she play them in the wrong order? And maybe she didn't do enough cost savings.
Well, I mean, I'm not the expert on how you get tax cuts in place or not, although I've been working with governments that have done it. Liz Truss never got a tax cut in Britain. She was thrown out of office before anything happened. She appointed the greatest guy in the world to be Chancellor of the Exchequer, Kwasi Kwarteng, who was really phenomenal. But she never got a chance to even try it. She was thrown out just by the hysteria of what she was saying, not what she did. So there is no judgment there on the quality of the economics whatsoever in that. And it just shows me the ineptitude of some people in being able to get something done. You not only need good policies, but you need to be able to get them in effect. And that's really, really where the mix was bad here on that. So I don't really know what to say about Liz Truss and what she did. She lost her seat, I understand. Her house there in Parliament, and I think she threw Kwasi under the bus instantaneously, trying to save her own skin, if I remember correctly. Fired him as Chancellor of the Exchequer quickly, and then and then she couldn't survive it. But that's not a test of anything about supply side economics or tax cuts. It's the failure of a person to be able to negotiate how to win and get your tax cuts in place. And she couldn't do it, and she lost. And now we have Starmer. So woo.
We'll come to Starmer and what we should do about him in a minute. We are about to experience Starmageddon in the United Kingdom, as people are calling it.
I love it.
But on the approach that you'd expect people of a kind of a Republican mindset in the USA or a conservative mindset here, give us a sense. There's no perfect answer to this. I'm not asking you a math question, but how much should we worry about debt and deficits? So should we be fiscally hawkish and sort of say, look, we've got to balance the books, so we want to cut tax, but we're also going to we're not totally sure that's going to lead to an increase in revenue. So we're going to get spending big under control as well. Or can you be a little bit sort of breathe out, loosen the belt, Well, if there is a bit of a bigger deficit this year and next, sort of so be it. If productivity and economic growth start zooming up to a higher long-term rate, perhaps we can live with that. I never know how to sort of strike the balance there.
Yeah. Let me point to two additional things to your question that are really important. We talk about taxes all the time, you and I, and that's true. There are five things in the principles of supply side economics. One is you want a low rate, broad-based flat tax. Second one, just as strong a pillar of prosperity, is spending restraint. Third one, it's just as important as the other two, is sound money. That's really critical there. Minimal regulations is the fourth pillar of prosperity. And the fifth one is free trade. So we talk about the one ad nauseum, but the other ones are equally as important. But let me, if I can, go with you on the tax one, on the spending. You brought in spending, which is correct there, and the use of debt. You know, when you think about it, let me ask you the question this way, Marcus. I'm going to let you borrow all you want at 1% interest and let you invest all you want at 10% guaranteed. How much are you going to borrow?
As much as I damn well can.
Thank you. Now reverse those two numbers. You can borrow all you want at 10% and invest all you want at 1%. How much are you going to borrow?
Not a bean.
Not a bean. The issue is not the debt. The issue is the spread. And the spread is there. Now, if you have a government come in like ours in 1981, now we came in to a country that had been tragically trashed by 16 years of what I call the Four Stooges, Johnson, Nixon, Ford, and Carter, the largest assemblage of bipartisan ignorance probably ever put on planet Earth. They came in and they destroyed my country. We dug deep in the rubble and the heaps, and we found this little imprimatur. We polished it on our pants and put it up there. It said Enterprise America. And what we did was we borrowed lots and lots of money. We did. And we used it to cut tax rates, to deregulate the economy, to increase all the good stuff. And then we sat back and prayed that it worked. We borrowed cheap and invested wisely at high returns. And of course, our wishes and our dreams came true. The wealth of America went way up. Yes, we ran a deficit when we could borrow cheaper and invest strongly. Then came along Bill Clinton. I'm going to skip George Herbert Walker Bush because he's a nothing. And then came along Bill Clinton, who was terrific as well, a Democrat. By the time Clinton came into office in 1992, the economy had achieved enormous prosperity, wealth had increased dramatically, and now was the time when the returns to new capital formation and new investments, et cetera, were dropping, and the costs of borrowings were going up. And of course, this is a reverse period. This is when you pay back the loans you did. And Bill Clinton reduced government spending as a share of GDP by 3%. With the best reduction in peacetime of any president ever. National debt as a share of GDP declined sharply. We had surpluses in the budget. I mean, just the way it should be done. This is the way it should be done. Now, once we get through that period of Reagan and Clinton, which are two sort of bookends of a great period of prosperity. I voted for Clinton twice. I'm a Republican, but he was a great president. I loved him even though he hated me personally. But I don't care what he thinks of me, but I thought a lot of him and I voted for him. He did not vote for me. But then we come into W and Obama and who they borrowed all sorts of money to pay people not to work. And of course, now you can see the huge explosion of debt, and it has worked very much to the detriment. So debt is not the issue. The real issue in this world is good investing and good operation of a government. If, in fact, you have very good uses for your funds, and it requires you borrowing some to put those funds to great use, if you really do, not just, really good productive use, you should borrow. If you don't have great uses and the costs are high of borrowing, then don't borrow. And, it's just like the individual or anything else. And to focus on debt is truly a huge mistake for any conservative government to do. You don't want to focus on debt. What you want to do is focus on the transfer theorem and on the Laffer curve with regard to tax rates. How you collect your taxes matters. How you spend the funds matters. And how much you collect and how much you spend matters. The three major importances of fiscal policy: how you spend the money, how you collect the money, and how much you spend in tax as a joint. If you tax people who work and pay people who don't work, i.e. bad, you're going to have a disastrous economy. I mean, you just plain are. And even if you do the job correctly, if you do way too much of it, we need government. We need it very badly. We need roads, we need judiciary, we need military, we need police, we need health, we need lots and lots of things from government. And there's a real role to be played by government. But when the cost of raising the last dollar of taxes collected exceeds the benefit from the last dollar of money spent, you stop already.
Yeah.
That's the optimal size of government. And what you find these guys doing is they go way beyond the boundaries here. I mean, in 1910, the U.S. government spending, federal, state, and local, was about 3%, a little less than 3% of GDP. I mean, and we did pretty well. We became number one on the planet with that type of policy, and we've gone way beyond where we should be. We're spending too much. We're spending it on the wrong things, and we're collecting it from the wrong people. But other than that, fiscal policy really looks great.
Well, I fear here in the UK, I want to ask you a bit about the extraordinary unfolding position in America in a bit as well, but you'll appreciate that most of our audience are from the UK. The one upside, I mean, it's not really an upside in terms of what happens to the country, but for those of us who are interested in ideas, it's an upside. The Conservative Party being out of office for the first time in 14 years means there's going to be a very long, hard look at what the Conservative Party stands for, what it got wrong. I mean, over 14 years in office, the tax burden in total has risen. Spending is at its highest ever. Barely a week went past without some new product or service or industry being more tightly regulated. The best that you can be said for it really is that it would have been even worse under the other side, that we kind of slid towards a sort of socialism, but rather than dash towards it. But John Wright asks, what advice would you give to the new leader of the Conservative Party? We don't know who he or she will be, probably won't know until the autumn, until the fall. What advice would you give them, Art, to provide a compelling vision for the UK economy that is more than just a sort of couple of targets? And I think what he means there is politics here has come down just to sort of slightly headline sloganizing numbers rather than a visionary thing about how to put right the underlying weaknesses of the economy.
Let me talk about a North Star. Wendy and Peter flying off to that star, to go to Never Never Land, and the North Star, if you look at it, and the 5 pillars of prosperity: taxes, government spending, monetary policy, regulatory policy, and trade. What you want to do is have the lowest possible tax rate on the broadest possible tax base. That's the North Star of taxes. Mm-hmm. Anything that moves us towards that North Star is a positive. Mm-hmm. Anything that moves us away from that is a negative. That's a key thing on taxation. Government spending restraint. And again, what I just mentioned to you there, we're spending way too much right now. There is a role, but we're way overspending right now. Anything that reduces government spending is moving towards the North Star. Anything that increases government spending is moving away from the North Star. You with me on that?
Yep.
Monetary policy. There's very little that can bring economy to its knees faster than unhinged paper currency. And if you look at that, what you want to do is have monetary stability, sound money. Where you have stable prices for as far as the eye can see, so that you and I and everyone else can negotiate contracts in pounds or in dollars and know what that means 5, 10, 15, 20 years, and it gives you a terrific capital market. So you want stable prices, sound money. On regulations, we all know we need regulations. You can't wake up one morning and pretend you're in Britain and drive on the left-hand side of the road. Then the next morning, wake up and pretend you're in the US and drive on the right-hand side of the road. We need regulations. We need them enforced. We need them very firm, very sound, solid regulations. But what you want to make sure is that you don't go beyond the specific purpose at hand, Mark, and create a lot of collateral damage in the process. And I could give you thousands of examples of this, but I won't here. So what you want is regulatory restraint. You want to make sure that the purpose you're doing exceeds the external problems caused by the regulation. So low rate, broad-based flat tax, spending restraint, sound money, minimal regulations. And this is the one I want to get to with your government, with my government, with all these other governments. It's free trade. There are some things we in America make better than foreigners, and there are some things that foreigners make better than we do. I mean, we and they would be foolish in the extreme If we didn't sell them those products we make more efficiently than they do in exchange for those products they make more efficiently than we do. It's called comparative advantage. It's called the gains from trade. It's called David Ricardo. It's called that. Free trade is not a joke. It's not a slogan. It's not something you woof off and some Hillary Clinton in her pantsuit says there. Free trade is a thing that drove the entire American economy from 1640 until 1870. I mean, just we ran trade deficits each and every year except for 5 years for that 230-year period. And the 5 years were, of course, the Revolution, 1776. You guys decided you wouldn't lend to us. Thank you. And 1812, you guys again decided you wouldn't lend to us. There were a couple of years in there. And then the crash of the 1840s, when we defaulted on our canal bonds to you guys as well. Thank you again for lending to us, but we broke it. But joking aside, we built our economy on deficits, on capital imports, because the high return on capital, and of course the U.S. trade deficit is the one and the same as the U.S. capital surplus. Now, let me take you to where that is today. Free trade is essential for every single thing you can think of, and I'm going to really slammer this home. You know, not only is free trade important with friends, free trade is important especially with enemies. It's especially true that we have free trade with Russia, that we have free trade with China, that we have free trade with Iran, that we have free trade with North Korea. You know, I'm not suggesting here, Mark, that we sell them nuclear weapons to be used there, but free trade. When you do business with people, you like your customers, you like your suppliers, you get them together, you send birthday cards, you have little parties on successes and all that, and you have social interaction with these people, and you discuss problems. You work things out. You know, you guys are having a real problem with the Uyghurs. Yeah, but you guys are having a real problem in the South with your black people. Talk these problems over. When you lock down trade, you not only get rid of the gains from trade, which helps both countries, but you also stop discourse and you create enmity. And anyone who thinks that sanctions should be ever used against another country is just crazy, crazy, crazy. Sanctions hurt you, it hurts them, and it really hurts the process of getting a peaceful solution in this world. I am just disgusted by the way all of our countries are talking about sanctions and the use of economic tools. Trade is not a political weapon. We have the State Department to talk it over with them. We have the Defense Department to bomb them if we need to. But don't use trade as a weapon of politics because it's a very bad weapon. We put sanctions on Cuba in 1959, Mark. 1959. How many was that? 65 years ago? Can you see how they've worked? We now got Cuba, we're pro-growth, free market, democratic, economic, capitalist. Oh, we love you, America. Thank you for showing us the things there. How stupid is that? The other thing that's just stupid in the extreme is if a country sells you products below cost and you're going to call them an enemy.
Yeah.
When I go to a store that sells me high quality products at low cost, I love that store.
Yeah.
I don't try to boycott it. When you got a country that sells you high quality products at low cost, they're my best friends in the world. No. We countries want to buy crappy products at high prices. So therefore we're getting the jobs. Jobs are not why people live. People live because they want to consume, not because they want to have jobs. Jobs should be there for people to produce high quality products that can be used in lieu of imports. And so we have comparative advantage trade. Please, please, please make sure your audience understands that what Britain is doing, what the US is doing, and what these other countries are doing on sanctions on these countries is the antithesis. My dear friend, Bob Mundell, in his Nobel laureate speech, said and laid it out really clearly. He said, the Smoot-Hawley tariff caused the Great Depression. And the Great Depression caused World War II. Believe me when I tell you, protectionism is a guarantee of a third world war, and you can see it at hand there. We need low-rate, broad-based flat tax, spending restraints, sound money, minimal regulations, and free trade with everyone.
This is fascinating.
Well, if you have a problem with a country, talk it over with them.
Through other means,
if you can't solve it, shoot them. But for God's sakes, don't stop trading with them.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to ask a question might pop up on your screen now. I'm going to ask the participants in the room, we've got well over 100, whether you think the Conservatives should commit to reducing the overall tax burden when we get back to office, measured as a percentage of national income. And I was just going to pick up on a few of the points that you mentioned there. you mentioned there are. Yeah, I completely agree with you on the issue of free trade and tariffs. The assumption that it's wicked foreigners who pay them rather than domestic
No, I don't
consumers is
want it.
pretty
But can
extraordinary.
I interrupt you for a second, Mark? You have on this question here commitment to overall reduction in tax, not as a share of GDP. You want to have low tax rates.
Yeah, but
You
that would
don't want
mean
it as a share of GDP. You can have very low taxes as a share of GDP. If you tax everyone who produces more than $1 at 1,000%, you'll have almost no taxes as a share of GDP, but there'll be no GDP.
yeah,
You want low
okay,
tax rates, and you
no
want to
fair.
expand GDP.
So, yeah, that's true. That's true.
Okay,
I still think that the state sector crowds out the private
it
sector.
does,
So
but
I
it
would
also
rather see the
does.
state sector being, I don't know, 25% of
But that's
GDP
not where
rather than
tax
20%.
goes. That's where spending goes. And
Yeah.
I do agree with you about crowding out there, but only in the spending sense, not in the tax sense.
Now, let me ask you a bit about, you were saying
Okay,
about the
sure.
tariffs issue. I can remember a few years ago being on a radio interview against a Labour MP here who asked me the completely bizarre question. After Brexit, then, Mark, what are we going to do with all this high quality New Zealand lamb and wine that floods the market at a low price?
Eat
Well,
it,
please
drink
eat
it.
it and drink it. Yeah.
What's wrong with that? I mean,
Exactly.
God's truth. We can sell New Zealand things. Believe me, they need
Yeah.
things.
Yeah. I'm
We
with you on
need a
that.
life in New Zealand. Can you imagine living in New Zealand?
Yeah, and I liked what you were saying about regulations being, if you like, having to be predictable as well. Yeah, I mean nobody's
Yeah,
saying
they should
let's
be
live in
and well thought out and stable.
yeah, and not too much discretion on the behalf of a
Thank you.
regulator. Yeah. But I do remember you mentioned about driving on the right side of the road. There is a story, I can't remember which former British colony it was. It may have been Nigeria, or Kenya, I think. I'm doing them a disservice, but they decided, as many of our former colonies did, to switch the side of the road they drove on because they thought it was a British imperial thing. And one official government notice said, "We will be moving the side of the road that you need to drive on as of Monday. The change will be gradual." I don't quite know what they mean by that. I think it applied to different provinces at different times. But
I love
thing
it. Love it.
on trade, you must be pretty disappointed with what President Trump's saying on this, then, right?
Well,
This seems to be a trade war.
You've got to understand Donald Trump. And if you look at what he did some very good trade deals with North America. The Mexican-U.S. Canadian agreement was a big improvement. We had some great improvements with South Korea, et cetera. Trump, you have to understand, you've got to take Trump seriously, but not literally.
Yeah.
Trump is a negotiator. And when he threatens tariffs across the board, it's to bring these other countries to the bargaining table to get them to lower tariff. Donald Trump is a free trader, pure and simple in this person's view of the world. He has explained to me that the only thing these protectionists, these mercantile countries want is access to the U.S. market. The only way I can bring them to the negotiating table is threaten them that they will be prohibited from coming to the U.S. market, and that's when they come to me and start negotiating a good deal, a freer trade deal. Now, just to back that statement up of Trump's, and I know everyone thinks of Trump as a protectionist, and he's not. He's a free trader. He just uses that to negotiate.
Right.
He was at the G7 in Ottawa. He had to leave early because he was going to Singapore to meet with Kim Jong-un. All right. And he apologized to the other 6 members, including your prime minister. Apologized to them for having to leave early, but just, I'm very sorry, but you'd want me to go there and meet with him. Believe me, you do. And he said, but I have one thing to tell you before I go. The U.S. is prepared right now to commit to getting rid of all tariffs and all non-tariff barriers if you guys will agree to it and go along with us.
Okay. So
and they all looked at their shoes. They all looked at the ceiling.
Yeah.
But he is perfectly willing to do that, but only if you guys are willing to reduce the tariffs, et cetera, because your tariffs, your quotas, your restrictions also hurt Americans. Yeah. And we're willing to bring all of it down to benefit the world.
Yeah. So I guess what you're saying is that trade negotiations are at least as much game theory as they are economics. Right?
Totally. And that's what Donald Trump is.
Yeah.
He's a game theorist. He knows how to negotiate. I don't. When he told me this, I rolled up in a little curl of fetal ball. I crawled under my bed and I started crying and wet myself. I'm not a negotiator, but he is, and he does it very, very well. And I just stand in awe. But believe me when I tell you, he believes in everything we do. And he is, if you look at what the deals are that he's done, they're great.
Okay. A bit more advice wanted from some of our audience here on the rebuild, the intellectual rebuild of the Conservatives here in Britain. And again, I think this goes a bit to the tax mix. Maybe you could give us an indication of where we should start. Yes, get flatter, broader, simpler, that kind of thing. But Bruce Goodwin asks, was much talk of taxing the rich. Little's discussed about how small business is taxed and regulated. We've seen in recent decades the public sector and big business occupy a larger and larger share of GDP. Should we not be talking more of reviving through lower tax and less regulation are SMEs, small and medium-sized businesses, traditionally the backbone of the economy? John Harrison asks, Dr. Laffer, as income tax is not the only tax we pay, do indirect taxes, sales tax, VAT, fuel duty, affect the optimal income tax rates or the overall tax policy in house? So give us a sense of where would you, if you had the ear of whoever the next Conservative leader is going to be in Britain, where should they start on tax? Should it be on income tax? Should it be on corporation tax? Should it be on sales tax? Or do you do the whole lot together?
Yeah, let me do the first person there who talked about small businesses. What do you call them? SMAs?
SMEs, small and medium-sized enterprises.
Yeah, that's the transfer theorem again. It just happens to not be from the rich to it's from little businesses to other people, so that it fits right in there. You want to get all of those people from whom the resources are taken, and reduce the burden of that taking, and then use that to reduce the disincentive of the use of those funds. So it's the same way as redistributing from rich to poor or from small business to other people or whatever. With regard to which one you take, you need to look at the whole tax system. And what you want to do is have the least number of taxes with the lowest possible tax rate available. There is no difference between direct and indirect taxes. We call them income and product taxes, but it's the same thing there. People work to buy goods and services. And it's precisely equivalent to if you tax work, which is an income tax or a direct tax, or if you tax the products, goods, and services. Let me give you the example. I'm gonna tax you 100% of everything you earn. How much are you going to work? None.
Zero.
Now, I'm not going to tax anything you earn at all, but I'm going to prohibit you from ever buying any products. How much are you going to work?
Yeah, zero, because the tax is so high, I couldn't afford anything, you're saying.
Yeah, it's a product. It's a correspondence theorem that fits there. It's like the conservation theorems in physics. Indirect and direct taxes have the same exact impact. The only thing is that's different about direct and indirect. Well, two things. One is you don't know what the marginal tax rates effect on supply are for indirect taxes. You really don't. Mm-hmm. What is a housing tax or with that? But the other thing is that's different is some taxes are easier to collect than others. So when you get a good broad-based flat tax, and that can be a value-added tax, that can be an income tax, or that can be a sales tax. All three of those are as broad a base as you can get. The way you choose among those three is which ones are the least costly to collect. And I'm going to say this is that businesses are designed to collect money. They know how to do that. Individuals don't. So what you really want to do is the more you can put the burden of collection onto business, the better off you are, because it's the same taxes that are collected. So what I did with Jerry Brown when he ran for president in 1992, I was his economist. We got rid of all federal taxes except for sin taxes. Okay, that little bitty bit that we talked about. We got rid of all federal taxes and replaced them with two flat rate taxes. One on business net sales, or you guys call it a VAT. Mm-hmm. VAT, and one on personal unadjusted gross income. We had those two. We got rid of all deductions, exemptions, exclusions, all the credits, everything. You paid the same rate on the first dollar to the last dollar. We got rid of all of those. If you did that and replaced all federal taxes, the number came out to 11.73%. So I rounded that up for Jerry to 12%. And then he rounded it up to 13%. So we had two flat rate taxes, 13% on value added and 13% on net unadjusted gross income, bump across the board. All right. And that was not static. That was static revenue positive. All right. We went from 8th in the race in the Democratic primary to 2nd in the race. We had Bill Clinton right in the crosshairs. We were just about to defeat him. We just won the primary in Connecticut. We just won the primary in Oregon. We're coming into California, New York. We had him. And then Jerry Brown announced Jesse Jackson as his running mate. And we lost the election by a whisker. But we still got the second largest number of delegates in the left-wing Democratic Party to show you that everyone understands that a flat tax, if you make 10 times as much as I do, Mark, you should pay 10 times as much in taxes as I do. You should. That's fair. But 1,000 times more in taxes, no, not. And so that's where we go there. I would go on maybe 2 flat rate taxes. That's plenty. You know, the least number of taxes you have, the better off you are. And you can put it with a border tax adjustment if it's politically feasible, but it doesn't really matter. A border tax adjustment is just like in terms of trade adjustment. It doesn't do anything. So that's where you are. I would do it in 2 taxes is what I did with Jerry. Value added and income, and then no other taxes. Get rid of all the other thousands of taxes you have in the federal level.
Yeah, so that's, I think the UK tax code, the tax rule book, somebody said to me is, I think it's now 14 times the length of War and Peace and considerably more boring than War and Peace as well. It's got to be said, like 14 times the length and 20 times as boring. Listen, but just on the tax burden going down, 95% of you agreed, 75% strongly agreed, 20% agreed. I'm just going to ask you about your view on some UK taxes. I'm going to ask the audience whether they think there are at least some that are on the wrong side of the Laffer curve. It seems to me that's pretty self-evident myself, but let's see what the audience thinks. Do you think at least some UK taxes are now on the wrong side of the Laffer curve? That's to say we could cut the rate and likely see revenues rise. I think the corporation tax at 25% is an example of that. I want to finish by, because you're typically a pretty optimistic kind of chap in my experience, but somebody asked the question in the chat, I've just lost it now, about sort of, do you feel we've been losing the argument somewhat? And how's it sort of look, do you think, on your side of the pond? Are you feeling optimistic or pessimistic? I mean, a heck of a lot's happened over there, right? You've had one president quit and another one shot at in the last week. There's never a dull moment in the United States of America. But Andrew Armour asks, has the argument for classical liberalism, free markets and individuality in the West been lost? Is corporatism and statism now inevitable? Or are we back to the 1970s and we're going to have to learn all of your lessons all over again, aren't we?
Oh, you do that anyway. But, Alice in Wonderland, it's getting curiouser and curiouser and curiouser in the process. And that's happened. No, I'm very optimistic about the U.S. I'm very optimistic about Britain. I think what you need to do is be very technical on your description of the game plan you want to go through. Let me give you an example. We had a beautiful tax cut there in 1981. Ronald Reagan was ERTA, Economic Recovery Tax Act in 1981, which lowered tax rates by 25% across the board, except for the highest rate, but I won't get into that. And I can remember the president called me right after the bill passed, which was right after my birthday. I think it passed on my birthday, and he called me 2 days later. He said, Art, we just got it. And he could tell, Mark, that I wasn't as enthusiastic as he thought I should. So he asked me, he said, Arthur, what's the matter? I mean, you don't seem as enthusiastic. And are you disappointed that we only got 25%, not 30%? And I said, absolutely not. I'm amazed. We got 25%. I'm really stoked about that. I think it's wonderful. He said, then what's bothering you? And I said, well, sir, you phased in the tax cuts. And he said, oh, you professors are all the same. You don't understand politics. No politician can vote for a deficit in the first bill. You phase them in so you don't have the immediate jump in the deficit and all that stuff in the bill. I said, I understand, sir. The politics is really good. But let me ask you a question. How much would you shop at a store a week before that store has its big discount sale? And his comment back to me was, oh, my God. How bad is it going to be? And now let me take you through what we did, because here's where a professional really is needed. We had a 5% cut on October 1st, 1981, a 10% cut on July 1st, 1982, and a 10% cut on July 1st, 1983. You with me?
Mm-hmm.
Now, as you know, there is no such thing as a mid-year tax cut. You don't have a tax cut on October 1st. You just don't. They prorated it over the whole year. Mm-hmm. So in 1981, on all income, which you paid in one tax return, all income rates were cut by 1.25% for the whole year 1981. You with me?
Mm-hmm.
On January 1st, 1982, you got the full 5% of 1981, and you got half of the 10% of July 1st, 1982. So it goes from 1.25% in 81 to 10% on January 1st, 1982. And then on January 1st, 1983, it goes the full 20%. We phased in those tax cuts began on January 1st, 1983. It is amazing how tax cuts don't work until they take effect.
Yeah.
And then they actually work. Now, if you look at the recovery, let me just go through the numbers with the recovery. This is where you need a professional. It's not just enough to flabbily give speeches and flamboyant waving of arms and that type of crap. That just won't do it. You need someone to technically go through the programs and the policies of the party to make sure that they don't have these flaws. From January 1st, 1983, when the tax cuts finally took full effect, to June 30th, 1984. How long is that? Is that 18 months?
Yeah.
Is that a year and a half? Is that 6 quarters? Is that what it is? In that 6-quarter period, that year and a half period, U.S. real GDP grew by 12%. Real GDP grew by 12%. We grew at an average annual compound rate of 8%. That's Chinese growth rates. The U.S. did. Reagan went from being one of the most unpopular presidents at the end of 82 to winning the election in 84 by winning 49 out of 50 states there. You know, you've got to understand the economics carefully. You've got to understand the monetary policy. You've got to understand the trade policy. I went through that trade policy with you ad nauseum because it's really important. You negotiate with your enemies and you trade with them so you have communication, so that you have intercourse with them. You know, if you've got a problem with them invading somewhere, use weapons, but don't use sanctions. You know, this is where you've got to be very clear. Don't let someone out bluster you and out talk you on some podium, whapping the desk and doing all this stuff. No, this is technical economics. Do the right thing and get it in there in code, and don't waver from the correct technical economics. All this stuff of a liberal education, I believe in free markets. You got to not only believe in free markets, you've got to get people who are quantitatively knowledgeable about what the actual quantitative effects are. It's not enough to have a good opinion. You need facts, and only facts. That's all that matters, is facts and facts alone.
And your story, Art, about the Reagan administration means we should also always worry about that old adage that politicians sometimes use economists a bit like a drunken man uses a street light, more for support than illumination.
Yes, that's very true. And Thatcher did the same thing in the first tax bill. She swapped out indirect taxes for direct taxes, and she cut the highest rate. She did do that, but then she doubled the VAT. And you know, that's not a tax cut, as I said. There's a precise correspondence. And it's, I mean, if she hadn't been saved by the Falkland Islands, you would have lost Lady Thatcher because of a bad advice. And I'm not going to go to names, but we could list the names of those who told her she should swap it out. No, she shouldn't. And then what she did was she made a mistake, a technical mistake there. When you drop the rate from 50p to 40p, I think it was, or 60p to 40p with hers. And then she pegged the pound to the German mark. And if you do that, you've got to have the terms of trade change. And of course, the terms of trade couldn't change because he was pegged there. And what that did was that caused double-digit inflation. It wasn't any per capita tax that caused her being thrown out of office. It was double-digit inflation. The same thing that happened in Ireland. When Ireland did all the tax cuts, but they were on the euro standard, you got the double-digit inflation. I wrote a paper how Ireland should what was it? What was it? What? Oh yeah, why Ireland should punt the euro.
Oh, nice. Yeah,
Thank you. You know, they didn't understand the technical aspects of the terms of trade, domestic inflation, and they went and did the tax bills beautifully, but then didn't do it right by having floating rates during that period to make sure that there's no British inflation. If that had happened, Prime Minister Thatcher would still be in office, dead or alive.
So I want to finish, Art, because we've run over our time. I want to finish with one question about Britain and one question about the United States of America. We're likely to see in the USA, whilst the conservative side of the ledger gets, in the UK, whilst the conservative side of the ledger gets its back together, higher taxes, more regulation. I mean, one particularly pernicious policy that's come up in the questions as well is about Labour's tax on schools, on private schools. You're now going to have to pay a 20% tax. So a good number of people are presumably going to take their kids out of private school because the tax is too high, and be a greater burden on the state sector, which is therefore paid out of all of our revenue. I mean, that's one example.
I love it.
What would be your advice to us on the other side of the ledger in favor of lower taxes, less regulation, a more marketized economy, as this stuff kind of keeps coming at us? Do we just need to hold our nerve and wait for it to fail? What's your advice on our side?
You do remember now what they want to tax private schools, and that's there. But you remember what Wedgwood Ben did? He wanted to ban private schools.
Yeah.
You remember that? I mean, it gets crazier and crazier in your country. I mean, we haven't gotten anyone quite that bad, but they're pretty close. Bernie Sanders, but I would swap out Bernie Sanders for Wedgwood Ben any day of the week. But there you go. But no, I would just do the best you can, vote the best you can, vote against the bills that are bad, use those North Stars and be very honest, very straightforward, do the right thing all the time. You're going to lose a lot. I was amazed that the Conservatives didn't lose more seats. I thought it was going to come down. My estimate was it was going to be slightly over 100 seats in Conservatives left. But no, it's about 130, isn't it?
121.
121, excuse me. And then Nigel Farage got a few seats as well in there.
5, yeah.
Well, 5. And I counted the two together. But I mean, I think you've got a great base. Sometimes it takes a step backwards to go forward. And if you guys sit down and do it correctly and design your plans correctly and stop wallowing in the luxuries of being in power, I think you can bring back a great success to Britain with prosperity. And by the way, you'll teach the Labour Party to do a good job as well. Labour Party is not, they aren't, I did not notice any of those governments under Labour, let's say, returning to nationalized coal and iron and steel and railroads and all that. They didn't. That's a darn good sign. I mean, that at least some of the stuff stuck, and you get back in and you do it right. I think a lot more will stick, and I think we can resurrect Britain to being, what does it say? Britain rules the waves, or is it waves rules? Which is it?
Britannia rules the waves.
Yeah, and then the Parliament waves the rules.
Yeah.
There you go. I'm sorry, that was my pun for the day. And I think making the pound strong again. I mean, I heard things are so bad in Britain, they're going to name it the ounce.
That's coming.
But we need to have strong money.
Yeah.
People don't want a weak pound. Remember when the pound was for almost 200 years, we had private banking in the U.S., no government banking up until 1913. And we had no inflation for 200 years. I mean, and then, of course, the government took over the printing of money and the control of money. And, you can see, what is it? How price level has risen, Brian, how much in the last 77 times or something?
10 to 300, yeah.
10 to 300, something like that.
Yeah.
Government running money is not a good, if they do the same thing with money as when they run anything else, they make it worthless.
Yeah,
that's why you see Bitcoin, and that's why you see gold rising so much, is because government monies are just not worth the hill of beans.
Yeah, so we need to get back to the sound money argument as well. I should say 98% of you on this podcast agreed that at least some UK taxes are on the wrong side of the Laffer curve. 80% of you strongly agreed. I think we're going to put up one final question, which is to ask whether we lost votes in July because of the very high tax burden. It reminds me back to George Bush Sr. When he said, read my lips, no new taxes. And then, of course, went on to lose the subsequent election to Bill Clinton. I did hear one apologist for him many years later. I said, well, that's what kind of lost you the election, isn't it? You promised not to raise taxes. You said, read my lips, no new taxes. And then taxes go up and you lose. He said, no, we didn't break our promise. We said, read my lips, no new taxes. There weren't any new taxes. It was just old taxes going up. Well, not sure the American electorate saw it that way, right? It was old taxes going up. Just
remember, dead liars lie still.
Yeah. Just last thought from you, because we run over time. Thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure.
Give us some thoughts about prospects for Trump versus, I presume it will be Kamala Harris. I don't know. That seems to be the bookmaker's favorite, the betting favorite. Who's going to win in that election, and what could we expect to see next?
I don't have any idea who's going to win in the next election. I wish I could tell you that. I'm hoping for Trump, obviously. I think I'd like to see Trump get the Senate and the House and the presidency. I think what you'd see is a great movement in all 5 kingdoms of macroeconomics towards good policy. That's what I'm hoping for. And the election, I mean, it gets stranger and stranger every day here in this country. I mean, it's just weird. I'm 2 years older than President Biden, and I resemble those remarks of his. To be honest with you, I have those moments of, I don't fall down yet, but I mean, he's an older fellow, and no one wishes him harm or anything, but we have an election where there are consequences, and we'll see what the electorate chooses. Just remember that the earth they are scorching is their earth too. People deserve the governments they get, and that's Brits and Americans do. You guys deserve the Labor government. Sorry to tell you that. And we deserve the Biden government. Now, let's see if we can't change this world to make it to where we benefit everyone in this thing. Jack Kennedy, Democrat president, said it beautifully, but he said, a rising tide, it raises all boats. Mm-hmm. And can I finish with just a quote from Kennedy? Because this is the one there, and Kennedy was known as the beginning of modern liberalization. He said that no American is ever made better off by trying to pull a fellow American down. Never. And all Americans are made better off if any one American is made better off. Mm-hmm. And then the line he said next was the one I used with Reagan in 1980. I brought it to him as a rising tide, it raises all boats. And that is the way you've got to see this world, is that, prosperity really benefits everyone. Rich and poor alike, black and white, old and young, fat and skinny, liberal and conservative, gay and straight. If you're transgender and like tax cuts, you got a place in my party. If you're straight and like tax cuts, you got a place in my party. You're tall, maybe not, but if you're just joking, this is all about economics, and economics has so many benefits way outside of economics. Economics stops wars. That's why you trade with these people, to stop the war, not to get it started. And good economics solves all sorts of social problems. And it's time we start really focusing and create the prosperity, and you'll see wonderful things happening all across the planet.
Art, it's been an absolute treat as ever. Thank you so much for joining us. Wonderful to see you. Hope to see you in person before too long. As you can see from all of the emojis, thanks to our audience. Thanks for all the questions. Sorry, I could only get
through these emojis? I don't understand them all.
They're showing how much they loved it. They're applauding you. That's what it all means. That's the reaction.
What are the little fishes with open mouths?
No, those are little.
Yeah. What's that? There's one there with a middle finger. What is that? V for victory when they do it that way? No.
Yeah.
You remember
there's one with a little thumb up as well. But
Winston Churchill was up your bum, up your bum. Oh.
It's been a real treat, Art. Thanks so much. You're so clear thinking and really help us, I think, distill our ideas. I should say on the last question we asked the audience, do you think high taxes cost the Conservatives votes at the last election on July the 4th? 85% agree with that proposition. 15% disagree. So not a scientific sample, I agree, but thank you very much for your feedback. Just
anything you could get me on the polls and send them to me, I'd love to hear them. And all these emojis, I'd like to know what they are and what they mean. I don't have a computer. I have a flip phone. I don't do emails. So what can I tell you?
I'll send you a full printout of them there.
You're wonderful. Thank you very much, Mark.
It's been a pleasure. Just to let the audience know, our next Pop Conversation will be advertised in our newsletter. Make sure you've signed up for that. There is a link in the chat. If you're a Conservative councillor, we've got a Zoom meeting for Conservative councillors coming up this Thursday at 7 p.m. If you haven't signed up to join that and are free and would like to, please email Andrew Allison. His address we can put in the chat is andrew@popularconservatism.com. Some of you might also be aware from last week's newsletter, I'm setting up a panel of Conservatives to provide feedback, guidance and advice on the Conservative leadership election as it unfolds, to try and inform the party and the media. If you're a PopCon supporter and a member of the Conservative Party, please do join that. You can find out more about that on our website. We've overrun our time, but it has been a fantastic hour and a quarter. Art, I'm greatly in your debt again. Wonderful
Thank
to
you,
see
Mark.
you. Thank you so much for your time and
My
insight. It's
pleasure.
been a pleasure.
Talk to you
Over and
later. Bye. Go ahead.